In the summer of 1667, diplomats from England and the Dutch Republic sat down in the city of Breda to end a war. When they stood up again, England had agreed to give up its claim to a tiny island in the far east of Indonesia, about 3 kilometers long, small enough to walk across in an afternoon. In exchange, the Dutch let England keep a colony the Dutch had founded on the other side of the world, a muddy trading post of a few streets and windmills on an island at the mouth of a North American river. The Dutch kept Run, the English kept Manhattan. Today, the land under Manhattan is worth, by one recent estimate, around $1.7 trillion. Run has no cars, no roads worth the name, and a few hundred families who harvest nutmeg with bamboo poles, the same way their ancestors did 4 centuries ago. By every modern measure, it looks like the most lopsided trade in the history of real estate. But at the time, observers across Europe were confident the Dutch had won, because Run had something Manhattan did not. Run had trees whose seeds were worth more than their weight in gold. Trees that grew nowhere else on the planet. Trees that a corporation had already killed thousands of people to control. This is the story of how a forest seed the size of an apricot pit became the most valuable object on Earth, and of what human beings proved willing to do to own it. But the story of nutmeg does not start at a negotiating table in Breda. It starts 10,000 kilometers away, on a cluster of volcanic islands so remote that for most of human history, the people buying the spice had no idea the islands existed at all. The Banda Islands, the middle of the Banda Sea, 8,000 years before a single European knew their name. 2,000 kilometers east of Java, in a stretch of ocean 4 to 6 kilometers deep, the tips of a drowned volcano break the surface of the sea. They form a group of about 10 small islands, with a combined land area smaller than a mid-sized city. At the center of the group, an active volcano called Gunung Api, which means fire mountain, rises straight out of the water to a height of roughly 650 meters. It has erupted again and again throughout recorded history, and the people who lived in its shadow learned to read its moods like weather. These are the Banda Islands, and for thousands of years, they were the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew. Not the main place, not the best place, the only place. The tree responsible is called Myristica fragrans, and it is a demanding organism. It thrives only in deep volcanic soil, in tropical heat, sheltered from wind and salt spray. On Banda, it grows in the shade of giant canary trees, some of them 50 meters tall and centuries old, which spread a protective canopy over the nutmeg groves like a roof over a nursery. A young tree takes years to produce its first fruit, and decades to reach full production. Planting nutmeg is not a business decision. It is a promise to your grandchildren. When the fruit ripens, it looks like a small pale apricot. Then it splits open, and inside is something that looks almost too vivid to be real. A glossy brown seed, wrapped in a web of brilliant crimson lace. The seed is nutmeg. The red lace around it is mace, a second, rarer spice from the same fruit. One tree, one fruit, 2 of the most expensive substances of the medieval world. In the wild, the tree spread its seeds through fruit pigeons, large birds that swallowed the fruit whole and carried the seeds from grove to grove. That was the entire distribution network, birds and a few square kilometers of volcanic dirt at the edge of the map. And this is the detail that shaped everything that followed. Almost every plant that humans depend on grows in many places. Wheat spans continents. Rice spans continents. Even other spices, like pepper and ginger, grew across large regions of Asia. Nutmeg grew on 10 specks of rock in a remote sea and nowhere else. Whoever controlled those specks controlled the entire world supply of 2 luxury goods. For most of history, nobody in Europe knew where the specks were. The people who did know had every intention of keeping it that way. a rock shelter on the island of Ai, shows human presence going back at least 8,000 years. Chinese records mention the region as early as 200 BC. Islam arrived in the late 1200s, carried along the same trade routes as everything else. By the time Europeans finally showed up, Bandanese society was old, organized, and very good at business. The islands had no king. Instead, each district was run by its leading merchants and elders, men the Malay traders called Orang Kaya, which translates, quite literally, as rich men. It was an oligarchy of traders, a kind of merchant republic scattered across the islands, and it ran one of the most profitable little economies on the planet. The arrangement worked like this. The Bandanese grew nutmeg and mace, and almost nothing else. Their volcanic islands were spice gardens, not farmland, so they traded. Javanese, Malay, Chinese, and Arab merchants sailed in on the monsoon winds, carrying the things Banda could not grow, above all rice and sago, the starchy staple food of the region, along with Indian calico cloth and Javanese batik. They sailed out again with holds full of nutmeg and mace. In 1603, one ordinary sarong-sized piece of cloth bought about 18 kilograms of nutmeg on Banda. On the other end of the trade chain, that same nutmeg was worth a small fortune. The Bandanese were not passive suppliers waiting on their beaches. The Portuguese writer Tomé Pires, who documented the region in the early 1500s, noted that they were the only people of the Moluccas who sailed their own long-range trading missions, taking their spice as far as Malacca themselves in their kora-kora, long, narrow war canoes driven by dozens of paddlers, with drums keeping time. They understood their position perfectly. They sold to everyone. They granted a monopoly to no one, and they were feeding a demand they had never seen. Far away, across the Indian Ocean, the historian Fernand Braudel estimated that India alone consumed twice as much nutmeg as Europe. From India, the spice traveled further west, hand to hand, port to port, until it reached customers who did not know Banda existed and who would not have been able to find it on a map if their lives depended on it. That ignorance was not an accident. It was the product of the longest and most secretive supply chain on Earth. And to understand why men would eventually kill for these islands, you have to follow a single sack of nutmeg on its journey west. A sack of nutmeg leaving Banda in the year 1400 was at the start of a journey of more than 10,000 kilometers, and it changed hands at almost every stage. Bandanese and Javanese traders carried it west to the great port of Malacca, the crossroads of Southeast Asian trade. In Malacca, it was sold to merchants sailing for India, where it changed hands again in the pepper ports of the Malabar coast. From India, Arab and Gujarati traders carried it across the Indian Ocean to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. From there, it moved by caravan to Cairo or Alexandria or the ports of the Levant, and in those ports waited the galleys of Venice, which held a stranglehold on the final leg of the route into Europe. Every merchant in that chain took a cut. Every sultan, harbor master, and customs official along the way took a tax. By the time a nutmeg seed reached a market stall in London or Paris, it had passed through so many hands that its price had multiplied to a level that is genuinely hard to believe. In the 14th century, by oft-repeated estimates, half a kilogram of nutmeg in Europe cost as much as 3 sheep or a cow. The spice was sold by the seed, handled like jewelry, and locked away like money. And the people at the European end of the chain knew almost nothing true about where it came from. Arab middlemen, protecting their position, had every reason to keep the source vague, and European imaginations filled the gap with wonders and monsters. The medieval spice trade ran on secrecy, the way modern markets run on information. What Europeans did believe was that these seeds had power. The German abbess Hildegard of Bingen, one of the most influential medical writers of the 12th century, praised nutmeg as a medicine for the heart and mind. Medieval physicians, working from the ancient theory that health was a balance of hot, cold, wet and dry humors, classified nutmeg as a warming spice, a drug as much as a flavor. It seasoned the wine and ale of anyone who could afford it. Chaucer name-checked it in the 1300s, writing of nutmeg put in ale. To drink spiced ale was to advertise that you were the kind of person who could afford to burn money on scent and warmth. Nutmeg had become three things at once: a luxury, a medicine, and a status symbol. That combination already made it precious. Then the plague came, and precious stopped being a strong enough word. In the middle of the 14th century, the Black Death killed somewhere between a third and half of the population of Europe. It returned in waves, generation after generation, for the next 300 years, and the physicians of the time, working centuries before anyone understood germs, explained it with the tools they had. Disease, they believed, traveled in miasma, corrupted air. Bad smells carried death. Good smells, it followed, could hold death back. That single idea transformed the economics of spice. If corrupted air killed you, then a pocket full of fragrance was not a luxury anymore. It was protective equipment. The wealthy carried pomanders, perforated balls of silver and gold stuffed with ambergris, cloves and nutmeg, held to the nose when passing through foul streets. Centuries later, the famous plague doctors would pack the beaks of their masks with the same aromatics. Plague had turned nutmeg from a flavor into equipment for survival. And nutmeg, exotic, powerful, and already classified as a warming medicine, sat near the top of the list of substances people believed could stand between them and the end of the world. Whether nutmeg saved a single life is beside the point. People believed it might. And there is no customer more motivated than a customer who thinks he is buying survival. Demand climbed. Supply could not follow because supply was fixed by the size of 10 small islands that no European had ever seen. The result was exactly what you would expect: prices that would embarrass a modern luxury brand. By the era of the Dutch monopoly, nutmeg was selling in Europe at hundreds of times its purchase price in Banda. As late as 1760, a pound of nutmeg in London cost 85 to 90 shillings, months of wages for a working man, a price held aloft by artificial scarcity. Gentlemen carried their own nutmeg, the way a modern executive carries a phone. Europe, in short, had convinced itself that nutmeg was priceless, medicinal, and possibly magical. There was only one problem, and it was a problem that gnawed at every ambitious kingdom on the Atlantic coast. Nobody in Europe knew where it actually came from. Venice knew only the Levantine ports. The Arabs knew India and the Red Sea. The precise source of the world's most valuable seed was hidden behind a curtain of middlemen 10,000 kilometers long. Every major power in Europe wanted to tear that curtain down. The kingdom that found the source could skip the entire chain, buy at Banda prices, and sell at London prices. The margin was not a business opportunity, it was a geopolitical prize. The race to find the Nutmeg Islands was about to begin, and the first ships to win it would fly the flag of Portugal. In August 1511, the Portuguese commander Afonso de Albuquerque stormed and captured Malacca, the great trading crossroads of Southeast Asia. It was the choke point of the entire eastern spice trade, and Portugal now owned it. But Albuquerque was not finished. Somewhere beyond Malacca lay the actual gardens, the islands where cloves and nutmeg grew, and in November of the same year, he sent 3 ships east to find them, guided by Malay pilots who knew the way. In early 1512, those ships, commanded by Antonio de Abreu, dropped anchor off the Banda Islands. They were the first Europeans ever to see the only nutmeg forest on Earth. What they did next tells you everything about the moment. They did not build a fort. They did not plant a colony. They spent about 1 month buying everything they could carry, filling their holds with nutmeg, mace and cloves, raised a stone pillar claiming the islands for the King of Portugal, a claim nobody enforced or even remembered, and sailed home rich. One of the expedition's captains, Francisco Serrao, never made it back. His ship was lost, and after a shipwreck and an ambush worthy of an adventure novel, he washed up in the nearby Moluccas, where he reinvented himself as war captain and advisor to the Sultan of Ternate. From there, he wrote letters to an old friend, describing the Spice Islands as a new world of riches. His friend's name was Ferdinand Magellan, and those letters helped convince him the islands could be reached by sailing west, around the far side of the planet. Serrao died in 1521, possibly poisoned, the same year Magellan was killed in the Philippines. The Nutmeg Islands were already collecting bodies. Portugal, meanwhile, learned an uncomfortable lesson about Banda itself. In 1529, a Portuguese captain named Garcia Enriquez landed troops on the island of Neira and began building a fort. The Bandanese looked at the foundations, understood exactly what a fort meant for their independence, and attacked the workmen until the project was abandoned. The Portuguese never tried again. For the rest of the century, they simply bought their nutmeg through middlemen at Malacca, like everyone else, only closer to the source. And so, for almost 90 years after European discovery, the Banda Islands stayed what they had always been: independent, prosperous, and free, ruled by their merchant elders, selling to all comers. The Orang Kaya had faced down the most feared naval power of the age and kept their islands. It was the high watermark of Bandanese independence, because the next Europeans to arrive would not be a kingdom of sailors looking for cargo. They would be something history had never seen before: a corporation with a navy. In March 1599, 2 Dutch ships under Jacob van Heemskerk anchored off Great Banda. The Dutch were latecomers to Asia, hungry, aggressive, and Protestant, which meant they were at war, in one form or another, with nearly everything Portugal and Spain stood for. Van Heemskerk spent 4 months trading for nutmeg, signed agreements with several Orang Kaya, and left 22 Dutchmen behind to keep buying spice for the next fleet. When the expedition returned home, the investors made a profit of roughly 400%. Church bells rang in Amsterdam. Within a few years, 65 Dutch ships had sailed east, so many that they began ruining each other's margins, and the Dutch state stepped in with a solution that would change the world. On the 20th of March 1602, the government of the Dutch Republic merged the competing spice ventures into a single entity known ever after by 3 initials: the VOC, the United East India Company. On paper, it was a company. It raised over 6 million guilders from more than 1,000 private investors in what is often described as the first initial public offering in history, and its shares traded freely in Amsterdam. Its founding capital was roughly 10 times larger than that of its English rival. In practice, it was a state. The charter granted the VOC the right to wage war, to sign treaties with foreign rulers, to build fortresses, to raise its own armies, to mint its own coins, and to run its own courts. 17 directors in the Netherlands, known as the Gentlemen 17, presided over what became the most powerful corporation that had ever existed. Stop and let that sink in for a moment. A private company, answerable to shareholders, legally empowered to conduct foreign policy with cannons. The modern world has corporations that are rich and states that are armed. The VOC was both at once, and it was pointed directly at the Spice Islands. The Gentlemen 17 understood the mathematics of their business with total clarity. Spices bought in Banda sold in Europe at roughly 300 times the purchase price, but that margin only survived as long as supply stayed scarce. Competition from the English, from Asian traders, from anyone, would flood the market and burn the miracle down. The logic led to one conclusion, and the VOC followed logic wherever it went. It was not enough to trade for nutmeg. The company had to own the source, all of it, exclusively, forever. The Bandanese, of course, had spent their entire history selling to everyone and swearing loyalty to no one. Two systems, each certain of its own rules, were now sailing toward each other. One believed trade was a relationship, the other believed trade was a contract, enforceable at gunpoint. The collision began, as these things often do, with a piece of paper. On the 23rd of May 1602, a Dutch captain named Wolfert Harmenszoon persuaded a number of Orankaya on the island of Nera to sign a document the Dutch called the Eternal Compact. Under its terms, the Bandanese agreed to sell their nutmeg and mace exclusively to the Dutch, forever. The document was written in Dutch. The men who signed it could not read Dutch. Most scholars doubt they understood they were signing away their entire trading system to a company on the far side of the world. Many of them probably signed the way you accept terms and conditions as the fastest way to make the strangers go away. By 1605, nearly every village on the islands had signed some version of the agreement, and almost immediately, every village went right on selling nutmeg to Javanese, Malay, English, and Portuguese buyers, exactly as their ancestors had done for centuries. To the Dutch, this was treachery, breach of contract, an offense against the sacred order of commerce. But walk through what the compact actually demanded, and you can see it was never going to hold. Start with authority. Banda had no king and no central government. It was a scatter of proud rival districts. No Orankaya could bind his neighbors, and in Bandanese tradition, a signed paper simply did not carry the world-ending weight the Dutch assigned to it. Then there was the small matter of what the Dutch offered in payment. The company's ships arrived loaded with heavy woolen cloth and thick damask, textiles designed for winters on the North Sea, offered to people living on the equator. The Bandanese did not need blankets. They needed rice and sago, the food their islands could not grow, and that food arrived on the very Javanese and Malay trading boats the compact ordered them to turn away. Exclusive trade with the Dutch was not just a bad deal, it was, quite literally, a starvation diet. And on top of everything else, the VOC paid fixed prices, below what English and Asian merchants offered on the open market. The Bandanese responded the way any trader on earth responds to a low bid. They took the better offer. So the pattern repeated, year after year. The Dutch waived their paper. The Bandanese sold to whoever paid, and inside the company, the interpretation of that behavior hardened into something dark. In 1609, the company's directors instructed their commanders to bring Banda under control, in their own words, by treaty or by force. 3 years later, a Dutch admiral wrote that there would be no peace until the Bandanese were totally conquered or completely eradicated. By 1615, the directors in Amsterdam were writing openly about subjugating the islands and driving off their leading men. Those words were not shouted in anger. They were written calmly in official company correspondence by men in comfortable rooms 4 monsoons away from the islands they were describing. The paperwork of what came next was being drafted years in advance. All that was missing was a spark. The Bandanese, pushed further than they were willing to go, were about to provide one, and it would cost them more than anyone could have imagined. In April 1609, a Dutch admiral named Peter Verhoef arrived at the Banda Islands with 13 ships, the largest European force the islands had ever seen. His instructions from the company were blunt: secure the nutmeg monopoly, and this time, anchor it in stone. On the 25th of April, Verhoef landed around 750 soldiers on Nera and began building a fortress on the old abandoned Portuguese foundations. He did not ask anyone's permission. For the Orankaya, this was the nightmare made real. 80 years earlier, their grandfathers had stopped the Portuguese from building on that exact spot because a fort meant the end of everything. A fort meant the strangers were no longer guests. It meant they were owners. On the 22nd of May 1609, the Orang Kaya invited Verhoef to a parley in a wooded grove near the shore, and they set one condition: come unarmed. Verhoef, apparently confident that men he considered simple islanders would not dare touch a Dutch admiral, agreed. It was an ambush. Verhoef and 2 of his senior officers were killed and beheaded. By the time the fighting ended, 46 Dutchmen were dead, and Bandanese warriors mounted the heads on bamboo poles, a message in a language every sailor understood. Among the survivors who scrambled back to the ships was a junior merchant, a bookkeeper, 22 years old, from the Dutch town of Hoorn. His name was Jan Pieterszoon Cohen. Remember that name, because the entire rest of this story bends around it. Cohen survived the massacre of his commander, and he drew from it a conclusion that never softened for the rest of his life. Asians, he decided, understood only force, and mercy was a form of weakness that killed the merciful. 5 years later, in a memo to the company directors, he compressed his worldview into a single sentence that could serve as the motto of the entire colonial age. "We cannot carry on trade without war," he wrote, "nor war without trade." His personal creed was blunter still. "Do not despair," he liked to write. "Spare your enemies nothing, for God is with us." The Dutch answered the ambush with reprisals, burned villages, and a dictated peace. The fort on Neira was completed and named Fort Nassau, and in 1611 a second, stronger fortress, Fort Belgica, rose on the hill above it. On the island of Ai, resistance was crushed in 1616 by an assault force that renamed the captured stronghold Fort Revenge, and hundreds of islanders drowned trying to swim to the one place that still defied the company. That place was a strip of rock and nutmeg trees at the far western edge of the group, the smallest domino in the chain, and the one that refused to fall, because the island of Run had found itself a protector, and the protector spoke English. The English East India Company had been founded in 1600, barely more than a year before the VOC, with a fraction of its money and a fraction of its firepower. In the Banda Islands, England could not outbuild or outgun the Dutch. What it could do was accept an invitation. The Orang Kaya of Run and Ai, desperate for a counterweight, offered England exactly that. On Christmas Day 1616, an English captain named Nathaniel Courthope landed on Run with 2 ships and 39 men. The islanders formally accepted King James I as their sovereign, which made this speck of nutmeg forest, by some accounts, one of England's very first overseas possessions. In exchange, Courthope promised what protectors promise: England would stand with Run against the Dutch. What followed is one of the great forgotten sieges in history. The Dutch blockaded the island. Courthope fortified the cliffs and refused to leave. He lost one of his ships to mutiny and the other to capture. Supplies ran so short that his men lived on scarce food and collected rainwater. An English relief fleet was driven off in 1619 by Dutch ships under the direct command of Jan Pieterszoon Cohen, who by now, at the age of 31, had risen to Governor-General of the entire Dutch East Indies. And still, Courthope held, month after month, monsoon after monsoon, on a rock 2 miles long, for 1,540 days. More than 4 years. The bitterest twist came from his own side. In 1619, London and The Hague, needing each other in Europe, signed a treaty that turned the rival companies into reluctant partners, entitling the English to 1/3 of the spice trade. When the news finally reached the Indies in 1620, Cohen was furious, thundering in writing that the English could not lay claim to a single grain of sand in the Moluccas. But on his rock, Courthope saw none of the treaty's benefits. No reinforcements came, no relief. London had, in effect, already traded his siege away, and nobody told the one man still holding the line. On the night of the 20th of October 1620, Courthope crossed toward Great Banda in a small boat with 21 men, answering word that the islanders there were ready to rise against the Dutch. A spy had betrayed the trip. A Dutch ambush vessel was waiting in the dark. In the firefight, Courthope was shot in the chest, went over the side, and disappeared. His body was never recovered. He was 35 years old, and he had spent his last 4 years holding an island his employers had already given up. The historian Giles Milton, who rescued this story from obscurity, put the consequence in a single line. Courthope's death robbed England of her nutmeg, and it gave her the biggest of apples. Keep that thought. It will matter in about half a century. On Run, resistance collapsed, and in Batavia, Jan Pieterzoon Cohen understood that the last obstacle between the company and total control of Nutmeg was gone. He had already told the Gentleman 17 precisely what he intended to do with that freedom. In a letter written that same October, he laid out his plan for the Banda Islands in 8 words that should be more famous than they are. The islands, he wrote, must be conquered and repopulated with other people, not defeated, not punished, replaced. What happened next was not a battle that got out of hand. It was a project, planned like a harvest, budgeted like a warehouse, and executed on schedule. In the final days of February 1621, Cohen assembled his force in the roadstead of Banda Neira. 13 large ships, with dozens of smaller junks and barges. 1,655 European soldiers, joined by the fort's garrison of 250 more. Close to 300 Javanese laborers and rowers, many of them convicts, and alongside them, a detail that sounds like fiction but is documented company record, roughly 80 to 100 Japanese mercenaries. Masterless samurai, ronin, recruited by the company at its trading post in Japan and brought thousands of kilometers south, reportedly because Cohen had argued, years earlier, that their reputation with a sword would be worth as much as the sword itself. Facing this force stood the island of Lontor, also called Great Banda, the largest of the group, home to several thousand people, defended by village walls, hillside forts, and cannon the Bandanese had acquired over a century of trading with Europeans. The assault began with a probing landing on the 7th of March 1621, which the defenders threw back into the sea. On the 11th of March, Cohen launched simultaneous landings at multiple points around the island. By nightfall, the Dutch held the coastal lowlands. By the next evening, the 12th of March, the whole island was effectively occupied. The company lost 6 soldiers killed. The Bandanese lost their country in 36 hours. But occupation was never the end goal. The population of the islands, 13 to 15,000 people, withdrew to fortified villages and hilltop refuges and waited to see what Dutch rule would mean. Cohen dictated terms. The Orang Kaya surrendered, handed over weapons, and accepted company sovereignty. Then he stationed garrisons, and he waited too. What he was waiting for, whether he knew it or not, was an excuse. History rarely hands out excuses as small as the one that arrived 6 weeks later. It was a falling lamp. On the night of the 21st of April 1621, in the village of Selamon on Great Banda, a lamp crashed to the floor of the village mosque, where the newly installed Dutch governor, Martinus Sonck, had quartered himself and his guards. That is all that verifiably happened. A lamp fell, in the dark, in an occupied village strung tight with fear. The Dutch garrison decided the crash was a signal. The signal, they reasoned, for a planned uprising. Soldiers seized villagers for interrogation. A boy, the nephew of one of the Orang Kaya, was tortured until he confirmed what his interrogators already believed, that the leaders of Banda were conspiring to massacre the Dutch. No other evidence was ever produced. None was needed. On the 24th of April, the company's council on the islands made its decision, and it did not limit itself to Selamon. The entire population of the Banda Islands was to be removed, deported, enslaved, or eliminated. Within a week, Selamon had been plundered and burned, and 1,200 people were already being shipped away from everything they had ever known. The Orang Kaya themselves, the merchant elders who had led the islands for generations, were rounded up. 47 were taken, 44 were condemned. On the 8th of May 1621, those 44 men were led into a ring of bamboo fencing erected just outside the walls of Fort Nassau. Under the smoke of the volcano, their people had lived beside for 2,000 years. 6 of the Japanese mercenaries were waiting inside the ring with drawn swords. The 8 most senior Orang Kaya were executed first, then the remaining 36. Every man was beheaded, and the bodies were quartered, and the heads and quarters were mounted on bamboo poles for the survivors to see. It was not an execution in any legal sense worth the name. It was a demonstration, staged by a corporation, to an audience of shareholders on one side of the planet and subjects on the other. We know what it looked like because Dutch witnesses wrote it down. A company officer named Nicolaas van Weert recorded that the condemned men went to their deaths in silence, without a cry, without a struggle. One of them turned to the assembled Dutch officers and asked, in their own language, a single question: "My lords, is there then no mercy?" There was not. And here is the detail that stays with you. The eyewitnesses were not proud. Van Weert wrote that it was so awful to see, and that the Dutch took no pleasure in such dealings, and he closed his account with 5 words that hang over this entire story: "God knows who is right." Another officer wrote that the blood of the victims cried out to heaven for revenge. Some of the soldiers present, according to the records, refused to take part. The men on the ground could see, in the moment, exactly what it was. The company saw a line item. Both of them wrote it down, and both accounts survive, which is why, 400 years later, there is no version of this story in which anyone can claim nobody knew. The executions of the 8th of May were the centerpiece of the destruction, but not the end of it. The end of it was slower, quieter, and far larger. Thousands of Bandanese had fled into the hills of Lontor, into the high villages and dry ridgelines where there was no water and almost no food. Governor Sonk's troops sealed the paths and waited. Through May, June, and July of 1621, the hills starved. Dutch patrols pushing inland reported hundreds of fresh graves. They reported something else too, something the company's own officers set down in writing. Rather than surrender to the ships waiting below, some of the Bandanese stepped off the sea cliffs. Cohen, in his report to the company, tallied the campaign in the tone of a man closing the books on a difficult quarter. About 2,500 dead, he wrote, of hunger and misery, or by the sword. Very few had escaped. On that last point, his arithmetic was mercifully wrong. Over the following years, well over 1,000 refugees reached the islands of Seram and, eventually, the K Islands, 300 kilometers to the east. They carried almost nothing except their language and their memory. Keep those refugees in mind. At the very end of this story, they will be the last thread left of old Banda. For everyone else, the numbers run like this. Before 1621, the Banda Islands held 13 to 15,000 people. Roughly 2,500 or more died in the conquest and the starvation that followed. Around 800 were deported to the company's capital at Batavia, where many died of disease, and where, in January 1622, 8 more Orang Kaya were executed after yet another confession extracted under torture. Well over 1,000 more, around 1,700 by most reckonings, were enslaved outright. And in September 1622, on the island of Run, the island England had bled for, the company executed all 160 of its free adult men after one more conspiracy trial, built exactly like the first. When it was over, fewer than 1,000 of the original inhabitants remained on the islands, most of them enslaved, kept alive specifically because somebody had to teach the newcomers how to cultivate nutmeg. A nation that had traded across an ocean for 1,000 years had been reduced in 18 months to an agricultural instruction manual with a pulse. Modern historians do not reach for euphemisms here. The word they use is genocide. The men who ordered it left their own reaction in the record. The gentleman 17, reviewing the reports in Amsterdam, sent Cohen a letter expressing their wish that the matter could have been settled by more moderate means. That single mild clause was the entire extent of the company's self-examination. In the same breath, the same directors awarded Cohen a bonus of 3,000 guilders. When he sailed into Batavia that July, the fortress guns fired salutes in his honor. He was later received and honored at the highest levels of the Dutch state. In his hometown of Hoorn, a statue of him stands to this day, and carved beneath his boots is his personal motto, "Dispereert niet," do not despair. They wished it had been done more gently. Then they paid him for how it was done. Both facts sit in the company's own records, one paragraph apart, and together they tell you everything about how the arithmetic of empire actually worked. The islands were empty now. The company owned every nutmeg tree on earth. All that remained was to turn a graveyard into a business. And the business, it turns out, was spectacular. With the Bandanese gone, the company faced a problem of its own making. It owned roughly 500,000 nutmeg trees and had almost nobody left who knew how to grow them. The solution became the template for plantation colonialism across the planet. The islands were surveyed and cut into 68 parcels, called perken, 34 on Lontor, 31 on A, 3 on Nera. Each parcel was handed to a Dutch settler, a perkeneer, on strict conditions. He would grow nutmeg and nothing else. He would sell every gram of it to the company, at a price the company set. And the labor would be done by enslaved workers, shipped in by the company at a rate of roughly 200 people a year, drawn from across Asia, and, in one of history's crueler ironies, including some of the deported Bandanese, purchased back to the islands because their expertise could not be replaced. The price the company paid its perkeneers tells you what kind of machine this was. They received about 1/122nd of the price their nutmeg fetched in the Netherlands, less than 1%. And even on that sliver, the perkeneers grew rich enough to build mansions with marble floors and chandeliers on islands most of their countrymen could not find on a map. That is how wide the margin on nutmeg was. The crumbs made millionaires. Around the plantations, the company built a wall of policy designed to last forever. Nutmeg trees found growing on any island the company did not control were destroyed, burned in annual raiding expeditions of armed war canoes. Exporting a fertile seed or seedling was punished as a capital crime. Nutmegs were reportedly treated with lime before export, precisely so that no seed that left the islands could ever sprout. And when harvests exceeded what the market could absorb at the company's chosen price, the company destroyed its own product. Witnesses in Amsterdam described spices burned by the warehouse load, bonfires of a substance men had died for, perfuming the whole city, while the directors watched their price hold steady. Understand what that means. Scarcity had made nutmeg precious. The company had murdered its way to the source of that scarcity, and now it manufactured scarcity on purpose, indefinitely, as policy. The company had turned nutmeg from a trade good into a state secret. The monopoly held, with brief interruptions, for the better part of 2 centuries. It may be the most complete monopoly any commodity has ever known. There was just one flaw in the fortress. One crack the gentleman 17 could never quite seal. On the westernmost rock of the group, On an island whose nutmeg trees the company had cut down out of pure caution, the English flag still technically flew. Run was militarily worthless now, stripped of its trees, its people dead or scattered. But in the ledgers of international law, England still held a claim inside the company's perfect garden. It would take a war on the other side of the world to erase it, and the price of erasing it would become the punchline to this entire story. Half a world away from Banda, on the eastern coast of North America, the Dutch had another colony. It was not much to look at. A fort, a windmill, a few streets of gabled houses on the tip of an island the local Lenape people called Manhatta. The Dutch called the settlement New Amsterdam, and it made its modest living in furs, not spices. By the 1660s, it held perhaps 1,500 colonists. In 1664, an English fleet sailed into the harbor and took it without a serious fight. The Dutch governor, Peter Stuyvesant, furious and abandoned by his own citizens, surrendered the town, and the English renamed it after the brother of their king, the Duke of York. New Amsterdam became New York. The seizure helped trigger the Second Anglo-Dutch War, 2 years of burned fleets and humiliations on both sides. And when the exhausted parties met at Breda in 1667, they settled on a piece of elegant simplicity, built on one rule. Everyone keeps what they currently hold. England kept New York. The Dutch kept what they had taken in the same war, the sugar colony of Suriname, and, at the far end of the world, the island of Run. England's last paper claim inside the nutmeg garden was gone, folded quietly into a treaty clause. Nobody at Breda thought of it as trading Manhattan for Run, and it is worth being honest about that. It was a general settlement, not a swap of deeds, but that is exactly what it amounted to. England walked away from the Nutmeg Islands forever and kept Manhattan. The Dutch walked away from Manhattan and kept the nutmeg, which leaves the matter of who actually won. Every sensible observer in 1667 knew the answer. The Dutch had traded a fur station for a share in the most profitable monopoly on earth, and they had taken Suriname's sugar on top. Sugar and spice against beaver pelts. It was not considered close. When Dutch forces briefly recaptured New York in 1673 and renamed it New Orange, the States General handed it back at the next peace the following year, and hardly anyone in Amsterdam mourned. That is how little Manhattan meant. They gave it back. 3.5 centuries later, the land of Manhattan Island, just the land, is valued by one recent estimate at around $1.7 trillion. The towers standing on that land produce about $1 trillion of economic output every single year. Run, the island the Dutch kept, has no roads, no cars, a few hundred households, and a harvest of nutmeg that sells into a world market where the finished product retails for about $4 a jar. Think about that for a second. The men at Breda were not fools. They priced the two islands using every piece of information their world could give them, and their world said, spice beats swamp. What they could not price was time. Nutmeg was scarcity, and scarcity can be broken. Manhattan was position, and position compounds. It is the single greatest lesson in the difference between owning a product and owning a place, written across two islands on opposite sides of the planet. The Dutch, of course, had no idea their prize had an expiration date. The monopoly looked eternal. It had survived war, competition, and rebellion. What finally broke it was not a navy at all. It was a one-armed Frenchman with a grudge, and a name that sounds like a joke. Pierre Poivre was born in Lyon in 1719, and his surname is the French word for pepper. Peter Pepper. Even his contemporaries found this funny, and he heard the puns his entire life while quietly assembling one of the strangest resumes of the 18th century. He trained as a missionary and was sent to Asia at 21. He traveled through China and Vietnam. Then, in 1745, on a voyage home, his ship was attacked by the British Navy, and a cannonball shattered his right arm. The arm was amputated below the elbow. The church was no longer an option for a man who could not perform the sacraments with both hands, so Poivre reinvented himself as a naturalist, a traveler, and eventually a colonial administrator with one consuming obsession. He had seen the spice trade up close in Asia, and he had understood the entire Dutch Empire in a single insight. The monopoly was not built on ships or forts. It was built on a fact of botany, the fact that the trees grew in only one place. Move the plants, and the whole colossus would tip over. The Dutch understood this too, which is why taking a fertile seedling out of the Indies was a hanging offense. Poivre spent decades trying anyway. As a young man in the 1750s, he personally smuggled a handful of nutmeg seedlings out of Dutch waters to the French island colony of Mauritius, then called the Isle de France. Most of the plants died, and sabotage by a rival botanist may have finished the rest. But Poivre was patiently turning the monopoly from a fortress into a memory. But the idea did not die. In 1767, the French crown appointed Poivre intendant, the civilian governor of Mauritius, and now he had a budget, ships, and authority. In 1769 and 1770, he sent expeditions back into the Dutch islands, crewed by men willing to risk the noose, guided by islanders who had their own scores to settle with the company. They came back with hundreds of nutmeg seedlings and dozens of clove trees, landed in secret and planted in the botanical garden Poivre had built at Pamplemousse. The trees took root. It took decades, as nutmeg always does, but by the end of the century, French colonies were harvesting spice the Dutch monopoly said could not exist. And then history, having cracked the door, kicked it wide open. The Netherlands was dragged into the wars of the French Revolution, and Napoleon and its enemies included the greatest navy on earth. British forces took the Banda Islands in 1796, gave them back in a peace deal, and then came back for good. In August 1810, a British squadron under Captain Christopher Cole stormed Banda Nera, scaling the walls of Fort Belgica at dawn in a monsoon rain, and the Nutmeg Islands changed hands one final time. The British knew exactly what to do, because Poivre had shown everyone the playbook. Before returning the islands to the Dutch at the end of the wars, they carried away hundreds of nutmeg seedlings and planted them across their own empire. In Penang, in Ceylon, in Singapore, and, in 1843, on a small volcanic island in the Caribbean called Grenada, whose soil and climate turned out to suit the tree almost as well as Banda itself. The arithmetic of scarcity collapsed. The VOC itself did not live to see the worst of it. Rotted by debt and corruption, the mightiest corporation in history was dissolved on the last day of 1799, its possessions absorbed by the Dutch state. And nutmeg, the seed once worth its weight in gold, the seed men had been quartered for, began its long slide toward the supermarket shelf. The monopoly that had justified a genocide evaporated within a single human lifetime. All of it, the compact, the fleet, the bamboo ring, the burned warehouses, had bought the company roughly 180 years of margin. The trees, indifferent as ever, simply grew wherever they were planted. While the old monopoly was dying in the East, nutmeg was starting a strange second life in a young country on the other side of the Atlantic. Americans loved nutmeg. It was expensive, imported, and fashionable, which made it exactly the kind of thing a new nation of aspirational shopkeepers wanted on its table. It went into puddings and pies, into mulled cider, and above all into eggnog, the drink colonial America built out of eggs, milk, sugar, and whatever spirit had escaped British taxation, usually Caribbean rum, later whiskey. The word eggnog first appears in print in the 1780s. George Washington, according to a much-repeated but unverified recipe, served his guests a notoriously strong version. And in December 1826, cadets at the West Point Military Academy smuggled gallons of whiskey into their barracks for a Christmas eggnog party that escalated into a full-scale drunken riot, with smashed furniture, drawn weapons, and 20 courts-martial. Among the young men present that night, though he escaped formal punishment, was a cadet named Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy. Nutmeg, it seems, has a talent for standing quietly in the background of history's strange scenes. The spice was so desirable and so pricey that it generated one of America's first great consumer legends. Connecticut peddlers, the story goes, sold counterfeit nutmegs whittled from wood to unsuspecting housewives, who discovered the fraud only when the seed refused to grate. The tale spread through the 1830s in the satirical Sam Slick stories, where the fake nutmegs were described as so like the real thing that no soul could tell the difference until he bit one. The truth is murkier. No documented case of an actual wooden nutmeg sale has ever been found, and a rival theory holds the whole legend arose from customers who did not realize a real nutmeg must be grated, tried to crack it like a walnut, and cried fraud. Either way, the legend stuck so hard that Connecticut is called the Nutmeg State to this day, an American state nicknamed, half in mockery, after a seed from a volcano in the Banda Sea. The other artifact of nutmeg's golden age was more elegant. From the late 1600s through the Victorian era, silversmiths in England and America produced pocket nutmeg graters, tiny hinged boxes of silver shaped like eggs and urns and hearts, holding a rasp and a single precious seed. A gentleman would produce one at the punch bowl and grate fresh nutmeg over his drink, the way a sommelier presents a label. It was flavor as jewelry. Those little boxes now sell at auction for thousands of dollars, monuments to an age when a seed was worth carrying in silver. A luxury, a legend, and a status symbol. Nutmeg had played all three roles before, on the other side of the world, at sword point. In America, it got to play them again, this time as comedy rather than tragedy. But nutmeg had one more strange chapter left in it, one that has nothing to do with flavor at all, because hidden inside that little brown seed is a chemical secret, and in the 20th century, the secret got out. Nutmeg contains a compound called myristicin, and in the quantities you cook with, a pinch here, a dusting there, it does precisely nothing beyond tasting like Christmas. In large quantities, whole seeds rather than pinches, it is genuinely toxic, and it has a long, miserable history of being discovered by people with no better options. Medieval physicians already knew the seed was dangerous in volume. The modern medical literature records its hazards with grim clarity, including the death of a child in 1908 and a disputed adult case as recently as 2001. Those two cases, a century apart, are essentially the entire documented death toll, because nutmeg turns out to be spectacularly bad at being a drug. The effects take hours to arrive, last for days, and consist mostly of nausea, a racing heart, a desert dry mouth, and an overwhelming sense that something has gone terribly wrong. Its most famous chronicler learned all this in prison. In his autobiography, Malcolm X described his time in a Massachusetts penitentiary in the 1940s, where inmates cut off from everything else bought stolen kitchen nutmeg from each other. A penny matchbox full of nutmeg, he wrote, had the kick of 3 or 4 reefers. American prisons responded by quietly locking up the spice cabinet, and toxicologists have spent decades pointing out that his description was, if anything, generous. Poison control centers report only a trickle of cases, a few per year in an entire American state, mostly curious teenagers, and virtually nobody ever tries it twice. The entire phenomenon comes down to one sentence: the high is not worth the hangover, and the hangover lasts 3 days. There is something almost poetic in this final indignity. The seed that once commanded the price of gold, the seed empires killed for, spent the 20th century failing its audition as a narcotic. Nutmeg has been a medicine, a plague cure, a currency, a status symbol, and a casus belli. The one thing it never managed to be was a good time. Which brings us, at last, to what nutmeg actually is today, and to the strange afterlife of the islands where all of this began. Walk into any supermarket on Earth, and you can buy the entire object of this story, ground to powder, in a glass jar, for about $4. The average shopper walks past it without a glance. Global production runs to well over 100,000 tons of nutmeg and related spices a year, and the old geography has quietly reasserted itself, because Indonesia, the modern nation that contains the Banda Islands, still supplies roughly 3/4 of the world's true nutmeg. The second name on the list is the one poivre and the British wrote there. Grenada, the Caribbean island that received its first trees in 1843, built its entire identity around the seed. Nutmeg pays a large share of its farmers, flavors its national dishes, and appears, split open to show the red lace of mace, on the national flag itself. Grenada is the only country on Earth with a spice on its flag, and the spice is bandas. That dependence carries bandas' old vulnerability too. In September 2004, Hurricane Ivan crossed Grenada and destroyed, by official estimates, roughly 90% of the island's 500,000 nutmeg trees in a single day. Another hurricane hit the survivors the following year, and because a nutmeg tree needs years to bear and decades to mature, no aid program on Earth could speed the recovery. Grenadian farmers replanted anyway, knowing the trees would fruit for their children more than for themselves, which is, you will remember, the same promise Bandanese growers have been making for 2,000 years. Meanwhile, the spice itself staged one last conquest, this time through marketing. In the 1930s, American spice companies began selling a pre-mixed blend of cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg under the name pumpkin pie spice. And in 2003, a coffee company in Seattle built a seasonal drink around that blend. The pumpkin spice latte went on to sell hundreds of millions of cups, spawn an annual cultural season, and put a measurable autumn spike into global demand for a seed from the Banda Sea. For the record, the drink contained no actual pumpkin for its first 12 years. The nutmeg was real. Marketing had turned the most fought-over seed on Earth into an autumn flavoring. A jar in every kitchen, a latte in every hand, an empire dissolved into the background noise of ordinary life. That leaves the 10 islands where every seed of this story was planted. The Banda Islands are still there, and they are still far away. To reach them today, you fly to Ambon and then take a ferry across open ocean, sailing only when the monsoon allows, or you wait for one of the small planes that lands a few days a week on an airstrip that stretches nearly the full width of Banda Nera. About 20,000 people live on the islands now. Gunung Api still smokes above the harbor, and the past is everywhere. Fort Belgica, rebuilt into a 5-towered pentagon in the 1670s and restored in 1991, still crowns the hill over Banda Nera, one of the largest European fortresses in all of Indonesia. Below it, along quiet lanes, stand the mansions of the Perkineers, marble floors cracking, chandeliers long gone, colonnades sinking into gardens that are slowly taking them back. On Banda Besar and on Ai, the descendants of enslaved workers and later migrants still harvest nutmeg in the shade of canary trees, 300 years old, pulling the fruit down with the gai-gai, a woven basket on the end of a long bamboo pole, in a scene that has not fundamentally changed since before Cohen's fleet dropped anchor. One of the growers still working the old parcels is a 13th generation descendant of a Perkineer family. The machine outlived the company that built it. The Bandanese themselves were never entirely erased, And this is the quiet miracle at the end of the story. 300 kilometers east, on the K Islands, the villages of Banda Eli and Banda Elat are home to the descendants of the refugees of 1621, and they still speak the old Bandanese language, the one that vanished from Banda itself 4 centuries ago. A people the company reduced to fewer than 1,000 souls kept their words alive in exile, longer than the company, longer than the monopoly, longer than the empire. On Banda Nera, a small monument called the Parigi Rante stands beside an old well, inscribed with the names of the Orang Kaya, executed on the 8th of May 1621. In 2021, 400 years after the massacre, commemorations were held on the islands and in the Netherlands, and in Cohen's hometown of Hoorn, his statue has become a battlefield of memory, splashed with paint, ringed by protesters, given a corrective plaque by the city in 2012 that names what happened on Banda. Dutch newspapers now routinely call the founder of Batavia the Butcher of Banda. The statue still stands, so does the argument. Amsterdam commuters still drive, every day, through a tunnel that bears his name. 4 centuries on, nobody is neutral about Nutmeg's dark chapter, because it was never really about spice. It was about what a market will do when it is allowed to own everything, including the people in the way. Nutmeg's story spans thousands of years of human appetite, and it fits in the palm of your hand. It was carried by birds between volcanic islands at the edge of the map. It was hauled west through a chain of merchants so long that nobody at either end knew the other existed. It was prescribed for plague, worn in silver at the throats of the frightened, and priced beyond the reach of the people who grew it. It built the most powerful corporation the world had ever seen, and it revealed exactly what that corporation was willing to do to a nation of 15,000 people who stood between it and its profit margin. It was traded, in the fine print of a peace treaty, against an island called Manhattan, in the most confidently wrong bargain in economic history. It broke free in the hands of a one-armed Frenchman named Pepper. It scandalized Connecticut, fueled a riot at West Point, failed completely as a drug, and conquered the world one autumn latte at a time. And after all of it, the trees are still on Banda, still fruiting in the shade of the Canary giants, still harvested with bamboo poles by hand. The next time you find that little jar in your kitchen, take 1 second before you put it back. Everything in this story, the fleets, the forts, the bamboo ring outside Fort Nassau, the silent men who asked if there was no mercy, the island swapped for Manhattan, all of it was about the powder in that jar. $4 at any supermarket, once worth more than Manhattan. Not a bad career for a seed whose first customers were pigeons. If this story changed the way you see your spice rack, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part surprised you the most, and make sure to like this video so more people can find it. We have many more hidden histories coming,